Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, and regulatory landscape and capital markets. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining me on the desk at the Nasdaq market site for Cybersecurity Awareness Month is Mike Tremblay, President of IT Cyber Solutions at Calian, Padmakumar Nair, co-founder and CEO of Ennoventure, and Hartej Sawhney, founder and CEO of Zokyo and Mamoru.ai. We're here to discuss balancing the benefits of AI with privacy and cybersecurity risks. Gentlemen, it's great to have all of you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks. Welcome to my favorite month of coverage, which of course happens to be cybersecurity. Let's go around the horn here. Mike, we'll start with you real quick. Tell us about Calian and where you fit within the cyberspace.
Yeah, we spend our time working with companies to enable them with IT, and of course, cybersecurity is always a major part of that. So protect and enable, usually mid-market, state and local, and in Canada, federal kinds of accounts. Yeah. Probably 1,200 customers we deal with. And
Ennoventure, tell us about that, Paddy, coming all the way from Dubai.
Yes, we are actually not exactly in the cyberspace, but we support brands with brand protection. So our data that we are providing is actually used for predictive analysis in cybersecurity.
All right, and tell us about Zokyo and the work that you're doing at Mamoru.
Yeah, so we've helped pioneer the intersection of cybersecurity and the digital asset space since 2016. And so our primary focus ranges from security reviews and auditing of smart contracts to traditional things like penetration testing, but all focused on cybersecurity in the digital asset space.
Yeah, which is something that's needed when we think about transparency, auditing, and being accountable for all this. Mike, when you think about the current threat landscape, what's the number one thing, or what's a series of things that you're focused on?
Yeah, it's very active. So the last few years in particular, we've seen the steady march here, and this is AI-centric that we're referring to, right? So on the threat side, of course, the bad guys have access to the tools. They use those tools to make it more invasive with end clients that they're targeting. They make it much harder to detect that a hack is occurring. But on the good guy side, you've got the same tools, right? So you've got an ability to be more prepared, be more aware of the threats that are coming. You can detect them in advance. And if a threat actually turns into an impact, you actually have the tools to be able to recover a lot more quickly than you would have had 3 years ago. Yeah. So a lot of changes in the threat landscape.
And Paddy, that's what's so interesting about it is, even within that 3 to 5 year time span, how AI is being leveraged for the good guys and the bad actors. I mean, it really does change the calculus of how cyber security analysis is done when you think about, the biggest threats that are out there.
Yeah, I think, I want to actually take all of you just out of cybersecurity also. See, one of the areas that we specialize in, we actually support brands with brand protection, I said. These counterfeiters are actually now getting into supply chain in a big way, getting into the supply chain. UN recently published an article that every two minutes a kid is dying in Africa. And this is happening because they are able to penetrate the supply chain and enter data that is not accurate. And that results in wrong product reaching wrong markets. So it's not just within the companies, it's actually impacting human lives also now.
Yeah, well, in a big way. I think part of the challenges too, Hartej, is there's so much focus, at least from my experience with covering this space, on mitigating and investing capital there, but there also is the response should an incident, and if it turns into a breach, when that occurs.
Yeah, and what's interesting about a breach or a hack when it actually happens is, if AI actually stops a hack, do you actually want AI to always just stop the breach? Because from a cybersecurity perspective, you actually might want to let it happen so you can study the hack that's happening to re-engineer it in the future. Which brings me to the point that we want to leverage AI in a hybrid approach where the end critical decision making is still being done by a human. And in cyber, to be honest, AI is not a new thing. We've had good old-fashioned AI for 20 plus years. Whether it's spamming or blockchain firewalls or firewalls that are traditional. But now it's all about generative AI, right? And Gen AI is changing everything because Gen AI can do real-time data analysis of massive large language models, and we can have proactive threat intelligence tell us to predict what is going to be possibly a security vulnerability or a threat and act in real time to stop it. So if there's a breach, companies have way less downtime.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mike, that's a great point that Hartej brings up because, since November 2022, when Gen AI, ChatGPT, became part of the consumer vernacular, it had to become part of a business's story, whether it's within the enterprise or, of course, forward-facing to your customers. And I can understand from the revenue and product lines that they want to get these products out there, but one, you have to have a problem to solve, right? You just can't attach it to your story. And two, it takes time to weigh the cyber and the security risks that these new models represent. So how do you balance that?
Yeah, actually, if I do want to pick up on a point here, and then I'll jump in. You've seen in the last year a lot of consolidation of the cyber marketplace, and I think that's a good thing. To the point you were making, there is an opportunity to see the consolidation of a market that has been fraught with too many fragmented players. The threat profile is a lot more complicated with customers having more and more players involved. And so when you see Palo Alto buy QRadar, when you see Cisco buy Splunk, when you see the heavy investments that Google and Microsoft are making in their platforms, this is a good thing for the market, I think, at this stage. I think the pandemic actually slowed down the natural consolidation of markets. And so I think the threat profiles will be better covered by having tighter platforms, less gaps, if you will, to have that coverage. So when you look at the balancing of AI with respect to cybersecurity, I think the most important thing that companies can do right now is to establish an environment that is safe enough, secure enough, that companies and employees can actually participate in it and feel like they are learning, but also developing a capacity and a capability. And that is possible using a TRISM platform, so trust, risk, and having that secure management structure that allows you to detect anomalies, protect data, and make sure that your applications are fully secured, almost like an umbrella strategy. And if you're the CEO or the board of a company, you need to make sure those provisions are in place, because at the end of the day, making choices on how these things unfold really will reflect back on the board and the CEO. If something goes awry, reputational risk is high, but there can also be financial risk if things go astray and you now have a copyright infringement issue or a full cybersecurity hack as a result of keeping a door open. So there's a lot at play here.
So, I mean, especially to your point, I'm sorry, Hartej, about the board and being able to communicate those needs. That's why you're seeing more cybersecurity professionals make up the composition of the board, which lends to your point, Hartej.
I was just going to say that as in the digital asset space, we're seeing things gradually become more institutionalized. We'll see the same thing play out when it comes to cybersecurity and digital asset companies, that we need consolidation. So if you're a cybersecurity company that wants to focus on the digital asset space today, you have to hire maybe 15 to 20 different cybersecurity companies, whether it's securing your smart contract or to do fuzz testing, formal verification. There's just too many different fragmented players. And so I do personally look forward to consolidation when it comes to cybersecurity and digital assets, just like we're seeing it play out in Web 2, but now in Web 3. And I'm curious if Palo Alto and the Microsofts will be the end buyer as well. And we see Palo Alto does proactive threat intelligence in Web 2 for a very long time, but none of the big cybersecurity players do that for digital assets today.
Yeah, I think part of that could be, and this is a different conversation, but just trying to understand the infrastructure behind digital assets is still something that these companies are trying to get their arms around. But Patty, you brought up a great point before about counterfeits in the supply chain, and I wonder if that goes back to Mike's point, where the tech stack is so big and with so many vendors, you open up yourself to vulnerabilities if they have an incident or a breach. So, would you agree that consolidation in the space is making it easier to determine where you're going to allocate this capital, and then, of course, train your team on all this?
Yeah, obviously, because to have multiple systems and to train your team, it's a cumbersome process. And obviously, like any other industry, consolidation is going to happen here also.
Yeah. Mike, when going back to Gen AI for a moment here, are you seeing companies put guardrails in place in terms of what you're able to put into those prompts, right? I mean, I would imagine that if I was a CISO, that would be on top of my head all the time.
Not enough. And actually, we're in the business to help clients to actually put that protective layer in place. But because it's so new, if you think about it, ChatGPT got people fired up. But to your point earlier, this has been out there for years. Like I entered this workforce, I won't say how long ago. AI's always been in it, but it just recently with generative AI, it's accessible to everybody. Everyone can participate. And so I think that plays a pretty significant role here in what is possible. So from our vantage point, we work with clients to help them feel safe because they frankly have not put those safeguards in place. It's still new. And if you think about a CEO, most CEOs really have no fundamental understanding of this area of the business because it is so new.
Yeah.
And the worst thing you can do as a leader is just let it happen. You need to spend the time on it, to my point earlier, around reputational risk and potential financial liabilities.
Of course it's financial risk, and how do you even quantify that, right? I mean,
Yeah.
brand, it's an intangible cost, and you can't afford to be down multiple weeks because
That's
there was a cyber breach, especially if you're a public company. These have to be reported anyway. But
But it's hard not to be excited by the power to augment your employees' power through AI. It's all about augmenting the human capability so that more of the smartest human beings that you employ are focusing on the most difficult tasks that only humans can perform.
Right.
And we let AI and the large language models handle more of the brute tasks that perhaps we shouldn't be spending our time on.
And that's a great point, but I also want to go back to what Mike said for a moment here, where we get excited about this technology. I mean, think about how Gen AI has been reported on the media, what it can do for helping organize your thoughts logically when you're doing something like a job requisition, or writing up a memo, how you can kind of spit that out a little bit faster and work on strategy in a more intelligent way. That's what we were reporting on, or what stocks had exposure to it. And cyber, it was almost an afterthought, right? And that pattern is playing out in coverage as well. And I guess, not only because it's October and Cybersecurity Month, but it's something that I think I would want to approach, the risk side of it as well. And I think that's what we're trying to convey anyway. Yeah.
No, I think the biggest problem with Gen AI is earlier only expert hackers could do this. Today anyone can actually do this, because all you need is to know how to ask the right prompt and get how to do this. So a lot of kids are also getting into this, using Gen AI and trying to see what all they can do. And this cyber threat is becoming a bigger problem because it's not just the hackers anymore. It's a layman also can get into that space.
What I find interesting is the amount of trust the average human or even companies place on AI. We don't place this much trust on the average human. But now all of a sudden we've got a large language model with generative AI, and we tend to want to complain if there's an error on the decision-making process of AI. But AI was trained by all of our collective data, and that data set needs to be pure. It needs to be audited. It needs to not be poisoned. And this is a very key part that we're kind of missing. Our expectations of AI need to be a little bit less. The final line needs to be drawn by a human who is sophisticated. We cannot rely at this stage on just AI to make critical decisions.
Right, and I agree with you 100%. So that narrative that AI is going to take away jobs and so forth, I think it only intensifies the editorial and the creative processes that are involved when at the end of the day it's the human that's going to make that decision. And if you especially if you're in a position of leadership, if you're taking whatever Gen AI spits out at you, you might want to rethink your business strategy there, because you could pull up something as simple as had the stock market perform over the past year, and we tested that on the desk. It said everything for the most part correct from a fundamental perspective. When I pulled in the data, it was data from 2023, not 2024. Right. If you just hand that in without editorializing it and fact checking, or even if you're writing a paper for school, you're not going to graduate, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think the human element is ever going to come out of it. So when we talk about this hybrid role and leveraging it in the right way, I think that's really what the story is at the end of the day, to your point.
I think it's really around a couple of things. I think it's around prediction, and I think it's around power. And there's a lot of things that are changing because of AI. The prediction piece is really around what AI models currently do. They're not fully autonomous yet. God forbid they would be fully autonomous before they're fully baked. But humans do have to make choices around the predictions that come out of these models, because at the end of the day, they don't always get it down correctly. But it creates an interesting management issue. If you think about how companies operate, anyone can use these AI models, and anyone can ask it questions and get responses and be able to make choices. But who makes the call, and who is ultimately responsible for all the calls? It's the CEO. So putting together a framework by which decisions can be made in an AI-centered world. There aren't a lot of heavy new production models that are out yet. There's a lot of beta stuff going on, so I really heavily encourage that. But there's a second part to power. So there's the choice that humans make. There's the regulatory piece that we haven't really talked about yet. And it's only now starting to form in this part of the market. Europe just put in the AI Act Canada has the AI and Data Act. The US has got an executive order from last year that is helpful in providing at least some guardrails. But if you're a CEO and decisions are made under you, you're the one that at the end of the day is responsible to comply. And how do you make sure those barriers and that structure is put in place so that you can feel confident about being compliant?
Yeah,
and yet not hold your company back because you want to compete.
Right. And Hartej, you know this in the digital asset space better than anyone. I mean, without that regulatory framework, it's challenged to operate in terms of what your parameters are, what you can do. Regulation by enforcement isn't necessarily the answer, which happens a lot in the U.S. But you don't want to stifle innovation, to Mike's point, because then you start to get the brain drain and going elsewhere. We've seen this in the digital asset space for sure. I think that's what makes it tricky with the balancing act. And yes, the EU has frameworks. Southeast Asia, a number of countries have framework, in Canada as well. The way that the U.S. legislates, it's just a very different thing. We can't just put a framework around something because laws are built upon laws. And I think that's another challenge, to Mike's point, that the industry is facing. Yeah, I mean, you see it all the time in digital assets, right, where you're trying to determine what the framework is. Back to that conversation for a moment with regulation, Mike, are you seeing any advancement there, or is the conversation happening more readily to where we might get to that point where there's a more discernible framework?
Yeah, it's getting there. I mean, these things are gradually happening. There are different frameworks that are in place around the world. The problem is they're not converging onto a common view. There's a lot of different views. So again, if you're a CEO and you're in that fundamental chair and you do business worldwide, how do you establish a framework of your own if you're providing and delivering services around the globe when you've got this moving target of different compliance requirements in different parts of the world?
Yeah, and I think the CEOs are in a position where they're thinking, well, do I just completely ban all of our employees from touching AI right now? Is that the right move? I personally would vote no. It needs to be leveraged, and your employees, if not, are going to secretly be leveraging maybe an open model and feeding sensitive company data to that model because they know it's going to augment their role at this corporation. But more companies need to be thinking about what data sets are they going to be filling into a large language model to feed clean data that they have control over, that was not poisoned, that was audited, and what are the governance practices inside of our company, and what education do we have in our company, because AI has totally taken social engineering with deepfakes to a whole new level. Social engineering has already been our biggest problem in cyber. Humans tend to be the biggest problem when it comes to how you get breached. And now AI has made that even more complicated. And so sometimes I find myself laughing if I say education is really a solution, but you still need to do it. You need to educate your employees to be more proactive and have a keener eye on what to look out for. What kind of deepfakes are penetrating the biggest companies this month? Employees need to be educated.
I mean, phishing seems like child's play relative to what the capabilities are now. And it goes back to your original point. When you think about vulnerabilities within the supply chain, you're also operating, among multiple jurisdictions. But I think, to wrap up here, the key point is it's data in, data out, and the ethical and responsible use of the data that's going in as well, right? And that could be very subjective, and that's why these guardrails are necessary.
Actually, coming back to that point, it's very, very difficult to actually manage employees today because they don't know what's the implication of this data that they're feeding. And everyone wants to do smartly, and because they want to do it smartly and efficiently, they are also feeding a lot of data. And it's becoming very difficult for a CEO or the management to actually monitor what is happening at the ground level.
Yeah. Well, I mean, isn't that incumbent on the leadership team to make sure that cybersecurity training is available? And I mean, we have it here. It's mandated. If you don't do it, you won't have access to your computers. It's as simple as that. I think it's incumbent, upon the leadership as well. It's part of your job role to make sure that your data, your customers, of course, customers trump everything, that their data is secure as well. So I think it's, it's something that is part of the DNA of senior leadership, Mike.
It is for sure, and just maybe stitching a few of the ideas together here. One part that we haven't really incorporated into the discussion yet is the ethics side of what can find their way into the models. I mean, you could have a cyber hack, which is one of your own employees that has decided to train a model to express a point of view against environmental advancement issues, for example. I mean, this can happen. And so one way to think about it is the personality or the value system of a company can be attacked in the models that are being built with AI. And do you want the market to look at your business and look at it almost like a person with a behavior, and look at that behavior and say, like, I don't want to do business with that company because of what they stand for, because of what they're expressing through the models that are being spit out of the platforms they're using. This is a big deal, I think.
It is a big deal, and we're at time, but certainly a panel for another time. Thank you so much for joining us on Trade Talks, and thanks for joining me from MarketSite. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.